This is the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast, episode number 12. Anyone who has tried to discern how people in a domain talk about the concepts in it, and then try to align stakeholders in an organization around those concepts and the words that describe them, and then share that information with computers so that you can scale the impact of your work, knows that you need a good system to manage your taxonomies and other terminology. Jessica Talisman argues that the W3C SKOS standard is your best friend in such endeavors.
Welcome to the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast, where experts on knowledge graphs and the semantic web share their wisdom with the digital and business communities. Our mission is to demystify and democratize knowledge graph technology and practices to make the benefits of knowledge graphs and semantic technology accessible to all. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 12 of the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast. I am really delighted today to welcome to the show Jessica Talisman. Jessica is currently a senior information architect at Adobe, but she is extremely experienced in information architecture and knowledge graph stuff. So welcome, Jessica. Tell the folks a little bit more about what you're up to these days.
Thanks, Larry. So I'm currently, as Larry said, a senior information architect at Adobe. And before this, I was information architect over at Amazon. I've worked in many different domain spaces, but my original foundational experience is in information and library science. And I worked as an academic librarian in the past with books, museum, galleries, library, art. And that really gave me the foundational experience and information and knowledge necessary to do my job.
Nice. We were talking before we went on the air about like how especially your like art and gallery and that kind of curation. Tell me a little bit about how it seems like that was really foundational to your current practice, or it's been influential. Tell me why. Is it there's something about the nature of those collections, or what's going on there?
I mean, one of the most critical things when working in that space in galleries, libraries, art, it's called GLAM, which is actually a great acronym for galleries, library, art, and museum. And
Nice.
and within the GLAM space, provenance and lineage is something that cannot be ignored because you're dealing with works, whether it be print books, art, obviously, an attribution to the artist or writer. And that's instrumental to building information in library spaces within that domain space. And so that taught me a lot about linking records. There's a super interesting framework that from the library and information science background, it's a framework called FRBR, which is Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Records. And the whole idea is to maintain the manifestation and expression of works, which is the lineage of a piece of art or a book, and being able to support proper provenance and attribution of works while maintaining lineage for the benefit of people and machines.
Nice. And it's so clear when you think about how LLMs work in the current state of AI, it's clear for the need for that kind of thing. But well, and that's kind of jumping ahead a little bit too to like what you do with this stuff after you've got it all organized. I think in almost every case, whether you're like a data scientist, an information architect, content strategist, a museum curator, whatever, you start with this pile of concepts and words, and then people like you turn them into something useful to both humans and computers. What's that? How does that look? Walk us through the top level overview of that.
So normally, no matter what, when I come into an organization or any sort of information environment or data-rich environment, there's usually problems, identified problems, and those usually are not the only problems within an ecosystem, an information or data ecosystem. And so, the idea of nomenclature or vocabulary is instrumental. It's the foundation of how we discover and find things within that ecosystem. And so, having to look at the current vocabulary and the current environment of how words are implemented, that starting point in understanding culturally and otherwise how words are used and vocabulary is used to not only define a domain space, but to help support information discovery and retrieval within a space.
Yeah, and because that's the classic. I mean, I think the way most people would think if they don't know anything else about information architecture, it's about discovery and discoverability and findability.
Yep.
But there's sort of levels to that. There's like I do a lot. I work more in the UX world, and there you're like here's how we're going to talk about things. Like with content
Right.
designers and UX writers, that's a common thing. So you just end up with like a control vocabulary or something like that, where you talk about it. But there's sort of a progression from that level all the way out to a full-blown ontology.
Yep.
That how does that escalation happen, I guess? From when does it become clear that you need, well, we really need to define these things. So I guess that's a
Yep.
glossary now, right? Or, you know.
Well, and looking at that environment, so you have a series or collections, and I like to use the word collections of vocabularies. Often they occur or exist as flat lists. And there are usually like internal belief systems that determine how these vocabularies are structured and implemented. Some are closely guarded. I will give the forewarning that within these spaces, sometimes branding and marketing will be also pretty protective over the vocabularies used, but not understanding that these are meant to work on the back end of systems to help facilitate information retrieval and discovery. And so when building for back-end systems, the lowest common denominator, aside from a flat list or controlled vocabulary, is to use something like an ontology like SKOS, which is Simple Knowledge Ontology System. It's a very simple ontology that helps to structure a hierarchy and simple relationships that are machine readable. And it's something that that one standard and lightweight or upper ontology, there's the characteristics that are included with that, but it's super machine readable and translatable, but it's also human readable, which is what's really critical about that structure. And so you can not only define parent-child relationships, alt labels or aliases, and encode those with ontological labels, but there's rule bases, there's standards included with that, which lines up with several other standards that exist for information retrieval on the World Wide Web. So having to structure and include those rule bases that are standards based as well helps to enforce a certain type of discipline and structure within that information ecosystem and data ecosystem, which helps to guide people towards best practices in not only why hierarchies or taxonomies are important, but the introduction of concepts like thesauri, or thesaurus. You can actually build a thesaurus using SKOS. So whether people realize it or not, that actually helps to shape a thesaurus. And then you can also have a very sort of primitive knowledge graph, but still a knowledge graph using SKOS. So it's like a nice little primer and entry to the world of structuring data and information to be disambiguated. So you naturally go through a disambiguation process and a structuring process that really takes into account and models information for how the human brain works in addition to how machines work.
That's so because when you think about all of this work, it's like taking a bunch of individuals' mental models,
Mhm.
ensconcing them in a system that everybody can agree on, which is no mean feat. But it sounds like SKOS is a real because I think a lot of people think of SKOS as just a vocabulary manager, like a
Right.
taxonomy manager, but it is itself an ontology and a way of
Non-poly.
organizing this. And I know you're big on like maybe talk just a little bit more about why SKOS is such a. I mean, you've mentioned all the reasons, the standards, it enforces best practices. Are there so that is that alone enough for that to be the standard for managing terminology?
For many organizations, there's no need to have anything more sophisticated than that because we often scale beyond what we are capable of managing. So it really is a realistic standard and ontology that it could be enough. For many ecosystems, we're learning more and more with, especially working with LLMs, that the complexity does not win the game. Volume or the amount of information doesn't necessarily win the game. But the idea of working synchronistically with LLMs requires structure. We all know that. And it requires disambiguation. So structure, semantics, and disambiguation, how do we achieve that? Something like SKOS might be enough for your organization, which is simply you need to structure and communicate that hierarchy and really basic relationships between things to start.
Yeah, and that is like that's I guess when what are the thresholds? When do you go from like boy, that's a nice SKOS taxonomy you have there, and like all the things we're talking about are in there.
Yep.
what's the threshold that goes from a nice collection of taxonomies or term lists or whatever into a full-blown ontology?
So when there's a need to have more complex or detailed descriptive relationships between things other than related to or is related or related, just the simple word related, or narrower term, broader term, because that's what the ontological labels render as. When there has to be more detailed structures, such as event or history structures, if you're doing event structures where something happened or there's something is going to happen at a certain time, or that there's a facet or something that's unique that needs more descriptive or detailed relationships. What's nice is before you have to transition to a whole nother type of heavier ontology or introduce more complexity, there's SKOS XL. And that is sort of the transitive or the bridge that helps you to build into using something like OWL, the Open Web Ontology language. So, and then invoke other ontologies. But the interesting thing is that with SKOS, you also can very easily bridge without much complexity to open ontologies such as friend of a friend. You can use Dublin core. Like there's really easy transition points, and the lessons learned from starting with SKOS and then building from there is that all of the other ontologies requires that you have some structure to begin with. You can't, jump. It's sort of like not knowing how to swim and jumping into the deep end, never having been in a pool of water.
Yeah.
So it allows you to incrementally build and check all the boxes. And even though it seems very redundant and slow and difficult and painful out of the gate, once you have that foundational corpus that's well structured with SKOS, you've set yourself up for success for introducing more complexity. So it should be sort of a scaled building rather than a coming out of the gate hot and going straight for what you perceive as the end result without actually being, mindful of your data and how it needs to be structured, shaped, and defined.
Right. And I'm wondering now the relationship between everything you just talked about and how it can help these LLMs that are, good at a lot of things, but
Yeah.
not good at the things you're talking about. Tell me about how that's evolved so quickly. We went from it was all LLMs all the time 2 years ago, and now then RAG, and now graph RAG, and now symbolic AI. And tell me about how everything you've talked about can help, because I think it's distressing to me how much that it's AI equals LLM, or, but that's clearly not the case. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, we have our perceptions of how to optimize AI and how to implement graphs correctly or vocabularies or graph RAG correctly within a space. And those are usually tightly held belief systems that are coming out of and forgive me for if I insult anyone, but coming out of the idea of sort of monkey see, monkey do, and that you're just going to replicate what you see in a space. For example, vectors. You see very often vector databases. That's all that we need. And so as we transition, it's introducing, and this is something that I've seen as being successful, is if your current implementation's not working, you usually have to look at the base foundation of what you're implementing, the very foundation. It seems sort of recursive or redundant or boring, but in fact, and it's very easy to want to take shortcuts that are sort of prescriptive and promise the world. And that can be problematic. So a lot of times it's just returning to the fundamentals and looking at your core data. Is it well defined? Does it represent my business and my business use cases? Is it well structured? Have I captured things like provenance or lineage? Am I able to describe content or whatever the data artifacts are within an ecosystem? And really looking at what is necessary to mobilize and to make your internal data assets useful within that environment. Usually what we have is right under our nose. We don't have to seek something outside of our own organization or ecosystem to create miracles. Like if your base idea or concept is to help to implement and successfully implement something like RAG within your own system. Does it have to be graph RAG because that's what everyone else is doing? Does it have to be vector DBs because that's what everyone else is doing? Start with the most simple architecture, which would be something like SKOS or implementing something according to those information retrieval standards, and measure and build iteratively so that you're able to encourage those feedback loops within your own system in terms of results from the LLM, what you can, how much juice can you squeeze out of rendering these results, while if you build something too large or something that's outside of what your data is capable of doing within your ecosystem, for example, like if SKOS isn't working, okay, let's try to add a little bit more complexity on top. But you should always be returning and going back to your foundational data model, no matter what.
And that model, so let's connect these together now. You talked about the importance of this data, and everybody say data is the new oil, and every enterprise is sitting on its own collections of oil, and so stitching that together from what you've talked about to like getting I guess, and stitching it together specifically to like business results, like you you thought you could throw an LLM at this and discern the entities and relationships and do this thing, but it turns out that you need to know a little bit more, like you were saying, like like the lineage, the structure, the specific structure of the thing. How does that I mean, and the architectures like RAG start to get at that, but what would be, I guess, what would be your dream scenario for the relationship between, like, how do you think your work could best be leveraged in new kind of hybrid AI architectures to to get the business results that people expect?
Graph RAG does not have to be a graph. That's the first sort of misnomer.
Yep.
Does not have to be a graph. You can actually use a pretty strong taxonomy, because at base, what you're looking for is to infer meaning, define and disambiguate what these things mean, and have some sort of classification structure so that when there are results, it can be properly classified and cataloged. That's the base result. Like, we need to the input, you should be equally findable on both ends of the model. And so if the front end doesn't match the back end, so to speak, you've got a problem. That's like the fundamental. So are we over-architecting and overbuilding? Yes. Are we holding on to these dear concepts that are sort of cultural within an organization or an ecosystem? That's something that I'm starting to reflect on my career and see more and more, that our failure to kind of encourage communication between domain spaces and collaboration across domain spaces has led to these sort of vacuums where, and it's much like these sort of echo chambers within organizations where a tightly held belief, and I'll give you an example, is like when you build vocabularies, it doesn't matter if it's structured, all we need are nouns. We need nouns and verbs. Everything needs to be a noun and verb. And that tightly held sort of concept or architecture, is that going to make the difference within your ecosystem? What is that principle founded upon? Is it a data science or a strange sort of NLP-ish type antiquated idea? And if those ideas keep on getting perpetuated and there's no communication between what each of the domain spaces has to bring to the table, then you end up going down a path that's very narrow and is not expansive and doesn't take into account how you can best optimize your architecture to make sense, so that to line up with your end goal. So using that example, if you build a flat list or vocabulary, and that is your rendition or your the way that you structure data within your organization, and every word must be a noun, how is that going to support your end results? Is that going to get you to being able to classify the results coming out of your LLM? That's the first question. Is that going to really move the needle or make a difference? Have you seen a difference? What if you did a little experiment and you modeled something, for example, a vocabulary with SKOS, and you threw out the idea that everything has to be a noun, and you A/B test that? That's like a pretty low fidelity test. And that can communicate volumes, but it can also create that necessary feedback loop that's going to break you out of this sort of rigid thinking that's driving your organization not towards innovation, but towards repeating the same mistakes you've made up to now. And that's what I see happening over and over again, is this lack of expansive thinking where your lone solo information architect comes into your space, because usually you don't have throngs of information architects or taxonomists or ontologists. And that person comes in and says, well, let's try to introduce some of these concepts, like structuring things as a taxonomy, following for ONZ Z39, which is a standard. To structure vocabulary specifically for information retrieval. Let's try these different things. And if we're so, siphoned off where we can't accept or introduce new ideas into a space, the other side of this coin is innovation and taking risks and scholarly communication, actually communicating between domain spaces, sharing ideas and innovating together, but founding those principles on actual proven information science and information retrieval principles, because ultimately we're looking to encourage to support information retrieval and findability within your results, your core results, whether it be with an LLM or without an LLM. You're trying to support information retrieval for machines and people.
Yeah, and that's the that mutual understanding between machines and people. And like you said, SKOS is like the place to start with that. God, there's so much you just said that I want to circle back to. Well, one of the things I want to circle back to is that notion that there's never enough talent, that there's never enough information architecture, taxonomy, all the talent you need to do this. And that kind of speaks to my favorite topic, which is democratization. Like it's kind of it's a hazardous thing to do in some contexts, but if you have an important task like this ahead of you and not enough talent, how can like adjacent practitioners like data scientists, data engineers, like content people or other information architects who are less adept at SKOS, for example, how can those kind of folks adopt what you're saying and at least get closer to that foundation you say we need?
Well, and this is an interesting one because I've been thinking about this quite a bit, is when I look at other domain spaces like data engineering or data science, I'm not learning SQL or Postgres overnight. I'm not learning, it's not an overnight transformation. You give me a spec and then all of a sudden I'm proficient in it. It actually, to be studied and learned, it takes not only on the ground experience, but it also takes definitely some academic work or domain specific experience. And you're going to have to read some books and standards and apply those then practically within a domain space. Something that's interesting, I'm not saying, don't learn from podcasts. Absolutely. There's some great resources out there. I suggest downloading the ONZ Z3919 standard and reading through that. It's pretty beefy, but it's worth the read. And, some of the SKOS standards, you can go to the linked open data cloud and just to start to understand how ontologies are leveraged within the open web, which, by the way, is how most LLMs are trained on that same structured available data that's structured exactly you'll see most of the base models have SKOS. So if you think about that translation between training data to the post-processing, does it help to match the structure of the data? Sure. So that sort of experiential aspect is really important. The academic, putting time into reading and understanding this domain space. And I will say something I've been looking at is San Jose State offers a remote and non-remote post-master's certificate. And I know this would exclude those who don't have masters, but that certificate specifically it's like a 6 to 9 month certificate that gives you a certificate specifically in information and library science. And so those types of programs are popping up at different universities. The American Library Association has only 16 approved schools for information and library science, and almost all of them are master's level. They also call them iSchools now. And so it can seem pretty prohibitive and because most everything's introduced or, exists on a higher level. But, the most interesting thing is not only like when you're an information architect, you move into a domain space that for the most part, within any sort of organization, predominantly, you're not amongst peers. You are entering a space that's very foreign to what you're used to. It would be a lot easier for me to work in a library and be amongst my peers where I don't have to explain so much some of these concepts and principles and open up the dialogue to start to ideate, around these concepts. And so there's like a really interesting perception where there's an expectation because you're a data engineer, because you're a data scientist, that a machine learning engineer, that this is something you should just know and that you're an expert in. And so just give me 3 hours, and I'll master this. I can do it. Or just point me to the taxonomy that I need to use. And in fact, like this is a skilled area, and it's something that does require a little bit of reading and studying and stretching outside of your comfort zone.
And it probably goes both ways. As you're talking, I'm realizing like it would be so, like you just said, it would be so easy to just get a job in a library and hang out with other librarians, and that would be great. But the real impact you're making is because you're hanging out with engineers and data scientists and all these folks and doing this. But it also occurs to me that like they could be coming to us too. It seems like I'm thinking about democratization, but there's also like some evangelism and outreach and indoctrination and maybe cult indoctrination or something, to get them on board with this stuff. Have you had any success that way, like kind of getting data scientists, engineers, others, adjacent disciplines more curious about this stuff?
Yes, absolutely. And it can take a bit depending on the organization. I do think that with LLMs, there's been this sort of rushed anxiety and I equate it to the building of the railroad, because I like to put things into metaphors. But you think of the building of the railroad, and there's that whole concept of the golden spike. And it's like we're building railroad on, and this is specific to like on either side, and this is historical, of the Deschutes River, the Pacific Railroad. It was whoever reached the Pacific Ocean first and nailed in the golden spike would win the contract, would win the prize, the big prize of achievement. And they would sabotage each other across the Deschutes River and throw quarter sticks of dynamite to sabotage the progress of the other. And this whole journey reminds me very much of that, in that it's high stakes for a lot of these larger organizations, especially, and there's been so much investment. And so I think that there does need to be a little bit of slowing down to have the logical conversations we were having pre this new AI boom. And that's going to be necessary for us all to take a deep breath and say, okay, let's really look and assess where we're at now and open up dialogue and really examine what we're doing well, what's not working, what research is predominating this space, what research has already been done, what research is coming forward or out. And let's see how we can holistically understand this space and our own space better, and apply some of these other ideas and techniques, and to your point, like, and I would say this is mostly pre-AI boom. What's really interesting is I used to have this exercise when I went into organizations, the first thing I would do would be get OpenRefine on the back end, because usually with security, and OpenRefine is a great tool. It used to be Google Refine for cleaning and organizing, structuring data, dealing with data. There's RDF plugins, which is resource descriptive framework. It connects, you can just out of the box connect it with Wikidata, the Getty, like all of these large knowledge graphs to validate schemas and stuff like that. So usually like a really fun way to start understanding and exercising in the space is with OpenRefine. And I'll usually connect it with Wikidata to show them what's possible and helping to structure and define a vocabulary, because it's exciting to connect it with and start to see how a knowledge graph works, for example, and how structured data works. And 9 times out of 10 in the past, pre-LLM craze, data scientists and data engineers would get so excited about it, and they would build these sort of complex models and think that was the end of the game. And they would align vocabularies internally with Wikidata, which is okay. I wouldn't say it's optimal, because there's like some flaws in that rendering and system. Plus, it's very noisy and big. But the idea is to use that as a way to get your feet wet and to feel empowered and enabled to structure data and connect it to other graphs and have those lines of communication through linked data apparent and open. And that is when the light bulb usually goes out off, where people realize, wow, this is really powerful.
Hmm.
This really makes a difference.
Because I think most people realize fairly quick that you're never going to bust silos, but linked data lets you span silos. Is that
Exactly.
sort of, yeah.
It lets you span silos and create sort of a common language and align internal languages and nomenclature, vocabularies with the outside world. So there's a larger, with the democratization of data, you have closed world assumptions, which is how an organization defines themselves internally, which becomes those sort of echo chambers. And then you have open worlds, the open world. And the open world is how the rest of the world defines and understands the nomenclature or vocabularies and relationships between those things. Is it better to have one over the other? No, but there has to be some awareness so that you can reconcile the meaning and structure of things. Because your customers, this is like the most instrumental, because ultimately your customers, your external customers, if you're public facing, is their mental model and is their structure and idea and definition of words going to align with your internal model, or are they going to be more comfortable and understanding of how the rest of the world's structured and organized?
Nice. I love that every IA conversation always has to at least allude to Conway's law, that
Of
notion
course.
of, yeah.
Of course.
But hey, to that also, I talked to Tony Seal a couple episodes back, and he talks about his ontological projector, that's the purpose of an ontology, project your view on the world. I've heard you talk about fingerprints, that like your unique organizational profile is like a fingerprint. And again, that's another powerful metaphor. You got golden spikes, fingerprints, projectors. Does that
Yeah.
does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is Tony's projector like Tony's projector in your org would project your fingerprint to the rest of the world?
It would project your fingerprint, but then also it defines it in a way where you can create those reference points to the things in the outside world. For example, if you take the definition of something within your space, which is like assets, how an internal organization like Adobe internally defines assets, which might be a subclass of a product, versus assets and how it's defined globally. There is also that reconciliation between those 2 points in space. And so there does have to be a reconciliation, especially now if it's being implemented in the realm of RAG, that there has to be that reconciliation, because whether or not we accept it, LLMs are trained on the open web, and that's what you're aligning your vocabularies with.
Interesting. No, that's a really brilliant insight. Hey, I could literally talk forever, Jessica, but we're coming up close to time. But before we wrap, I want to ask, is there anything that you'd like to revisit from the conversation, or that you just want to make sure we share before we wrap up?
I think continuing the conversations, and where I think the real gold in these dialogues happens is in the exchange of ideas and the willingness to be thoughtful and reflective, and to that we're all sort of swimming in this space together, and that it's the exchange of ideas, something that in the library space is called scholarly communications, which keeps us from repeating each other's research. It's actually the foundation for innovation. And so I think one of the most exciting things, and sort of the theme of our conversation around also democratization of data, is that scholarly communications is the foundation of how innovation happens, usually in the research domains and spaces, and definitely in the library and archives space. So I think it'll be really instrumental for us to move forward as a whole, all of our different communities, and continuing to exchange ideas, and building on top of each other's contributions to the space.
That is fantastic. That's a great note to end on too, that like the call to like, well, hey, we need to be interacting more. It's all about keeping the conversations going. Oh, and by the way, there's this well-established scholarly communications discipline that can facilitate this in a way that promotes innovation. That's fantastic. Well, thanks so much. Oh, one very last thing, Jessica. If folks want to connect with you or follow you online, what's the best place to find you?
LinkedIn for sure. It's easiest. And if you message me, if you have a personal message, or I would love if anyone shared antidotes, just because I'm in the middle of writing a book that hopefully will be near done by next summer. It's a long timeline, but I would love to hear some antidotes from the wild, actually.
Excellent.
Anyone who wants to
I'll put that in the show notes as well. And it's a fascinating book about the long history of information architecture. And yeah, I'm gonna have you back to talk about that closer to publication date. So
Definitely. Yeah, I would love to hear people's like war stories and anything else they want to contribute, because I'm knee deep in it and want to hear other people's experiences. So
absolutely, we'll get that. I'll make sure. Yeah, we'll do get the word out in social media about that.
Perfect.
Well, thank you so much, Jessica. I really enjoyed the conversation.
This was fun. Thank you so much for having me.
For show notes and to sign up for our newsletter, visit our website at knowledgegraphinsights.com, and please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for listening.